Okay, now we're going to take a look at some image adjustments and things we can do to actually start editing our photos. And I've loaded in the Lake Rocks photo from the content directory. That'll be located on the CD-ROM or part of the download in a folder. I'm just going to expand this out a little bit. And let's start taking a look at some of the options we have for here. We can go to Image, Adjustments, and now we have all of these different adjustments we can do to this image. And we have levels, auto contrast, auto color, curves, color balance, brightness and contrast, hue and saturation, desaturate, match color, replace color, selective color, channel mixer, gradient map, photo filter, shadow and highlight, exposure, invert, equalize, threshold, posterize, and variations. So I'm going to start out with levels and start working my way through all of these different adjustments. Levels, as you can see, we have a histogram, and we also covered levels a little bit earlier when we had our layers panel. So I'm just going to kind of move this out of the way so we can see the image while we're editing. But I'm editing our RGB channel because with levels we can also edit individual channels. We can edit just the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, and if you're working in CYMK, it will also show up as the CYMK colors. But I'm just going to set this to RGB right now, so I'm editing the entire image and not just an individual channel. We have our histogram view, which is showing pretty much our color and lightness balance that we have throughout our image. And we can use this as a reference to sort of drag the sliders along the bottom to either brighten up or darken the image. And of course, adjust the midpoint. As we pull up our bottom here, you can see we can lighten the image by pulling up this whiter one. So this is a real fast way to lighten up this image, is just by dragging this over to the left just a little. And then we can adjust our midpoint, which is pretty much just adjusting our contrast. So the midpoint with levels is really pretty much your contrast. So we can get some sharper colors in there and differences between the colors. And then on the left we can also darken up the darker areas already and get a very vibrant image if we wanted to. So I'm just going to move these around just a bit. And what you'll also notice is we have a preview already in Photoshop. If you're using maybe an older system and the preview isn't exactly holding up, in other words, your system really can't handle that interactive preview, you can always turn that off. Or you can just turn it off and on so you can see what the image looked like before. And as you can see, it looks a little washed out, the original image, but when we click preview, we can see that it's much brighter, much sharper colors, and it really jumps out at you a lot more than it did before. So that's a quick, easy way to edit your image. We also have some other options in here where we have the black point, pretty much the midpoint, gray point, and then our white point. And what I'm going to do is hit cancel really quick so I can show you how these work. And I'm going to go back to image, adjustments, levels, and now I'm going to show you how the white point and the black point and the midpoint work. Pretty much white point is you're defining, it's a real quick way to brighten up an image. So if we know that we want the image a lot whiter, and we're going to select our white point. If we want it a lot brighter, we can select white point and then actually select what is going to be the brightest part of our image. If we selected a dark part of the image, then it's really going to light it up. But if we go over here to sort of these white areas, and we know that that should be white, if I go ahead and click on it, you'll see that it brightens up the whole image, because what it's doing is it's taking and calculating if this is the lightest part of the image, and it compensates everything else. It also works with black point. So I could select that we know that this is going to be the darkest part of the image. I can click on that, and then that balances out. So that's a really quick way to get this actual color and actual contrast the way it was when the image was shot, even though the camera didn't exactly take the best image. And then we also have our midpoint, which is adjusting the grays. So we could say maybe this is the midpoint of the image. We can select that. And as you can see, this adjusts the color a lot more. So you can play around with that as well. And you can see we have more of a yellower rocks now. I could select in the actual water of the lake, maybe the white. And you get different types of effects. And you can also overcompensate for things by using these tools and get some exaggerated effects. So if I select our white point tool and now select a black area, you'll see that it really brightens up the whole image, because now what was considered the darkest point is now considered the lightest point. So we have all these little flecks in here. That's all that's really left. So there's really not much left of that image, but we can just Control Z and undo that. But if we selected a white point that maybe wasn't the whitest part of the image, let's say these clouds up here, you see that it overexposes our image and we get a very, very bright image. Same thing with the dark. If I select the whitest part as the black, it of course gives us a very interesting looking image. So there's a lot we can do with our levels, and we can also adjust how high our output level is of this. And you can see how it just kind of washes it out, and that's sort of your brightness that you have there. So your middle here is your contrast, and this is your brightness. So it's another way of using the brightness contrast tool, but it's much more accurate. And if you're going to be brightening or darkening images, I would suggest using levels over brightness and contrast because you have much more power over it. Now we also have some other tools under image adjustments. We could do auto levels, and as you can see, that pretty much gave us a pretty close accurate what we just had of our levels that we adjusted ourselves. So auto levels actually is fairly good and works pretty well if you just need to quickly go through images or set up even a batch process to go through all of your images that way. We also have an auto contrast. We can see how that works, and that pretty much feeds off of our brightness and contrast. And we have an auto color, because if your color isn't exactly right, sometimes when you take a photo, it won't be the exact color because of the lighting situation or the way the camera is reading the light, and you can do an auto color, and it tries its best to get what the actual color of the image should be, and it's usually pretty accurate, so it's a pretty good tool. I'm going to go back, and now we have curves. And now curve is another way to edit our brightness and contrast, in which we can also edit each individual channel, or we can just edit one channel. And what this allows us to do is use this curve down the center to adjust our brightness and contrast. So I'm just going to click on the center and sort of drag that out. And now you can see we have this curve and we have it more towards the light side. And then I can bring it down and we have more towards the dark side. But we can also use this to sort of cap out white areas or black areas. As you can see, it starts to sort of plateau on the top if we move it to that point. We can also add more than one point. I could go up and down with this if I wanted to. And now we actually inverted the image for the most part, because actually the easiest way to invert with curves is just to do the exact opposite of the image you already had. And then you can adjust that, of course, the darkness. But we can also go a little crazy with it if we wanted to, and just go up and down and get some interesting looking colors out of it. So curves is pretty neat. We could also adjust, just like I said, specific colors. So we could adjust the red, give it more of a red, maybe decrease the green level, and then adjust the blue. And now this is a sort of ridiculous looking image, but if you really need to do some drastic effects, you could of course do it like this. Otherwise, just very subtle curves will adjust your image perfectly. And what we can also do is draw in our curves if we need to by using this pencil tool on the bottom. Or we can have our points, and that allows us to edit afterwards. So I can draw in the curve and then edit it afterwards if you want to be extremely precise about something and you know exactly how you want that curve to go, if you can just draw it out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel now because we don't need to use this option, but that's the curves tool. I'm going to go back to adjustments, and we have color balance. Color balance is a neat little tool that allows us to sort of spread our color out throughout the image, where we can adjust shadows, midtones, and highlights. Midtones by default. Preserve luminosity will allow us to keep our whitest areas at the whites and the blackest areas at the black. So pretty much it doesn't adjust our overall brightness of our image or darkness of our image. So it preserves our luminosity, which is our brightness. We can adjust and move it more to a yellow from a blue, or more blue than yellow, and we can adjust our green to magenta and cyan to red. So you can play around with these color balances and get a different type of effect. We can also adjust, like I said, our shadows and change the color of our shadows or the darker areas, because shadows are just pretty much the dark area image, and the highlights are the lighter areas of the image. So as you can see, with highlights, I'm mostly editing the sky. And with shadows, I'm mostly editing the rocks and a little bit of the sky, the darker areas. And like I said, we can preview that if you want to see what the image looked like before and then after. But I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. and go back through one of the other ones. We also have brightness and contrast, which is another uh, important tool. I prefer levels, but some people prefer using brightness and contrast, or at least the two together. Because what we can do is just up our contrast, which is sort of the equivalent of adjusting that midpoint in levels, but it does go a lot more beyond what you'd see. It's more close to that curves tool, because they all kind of feed off each other for sort of the same type of effect, but with different variations within them. We can wash this out a little, or make it a lot darker just by adjusting the brightness. But we can also adjust this image so it looks a lot crisper and more contrast just by using brightness and contrast. And you see we pretty much get the same effect that we have with levels. It just depends on what's easiest for you and how in depth you really need to get with that image. Go ahead and cancel that. And let's take a look at some of our other adjustments. We have hue and saturation on the top of this next set. And hue and saturation is very important for editing color, because we can change the color of our image by adjusting its hue. So as we move our hue along here, we can see that we're changing the color, and now we have, at the end of each side, we have a pretty much inverted color, even though the lightness is not inverted. So that's kind of a neat effect. But we can change the effects of anything. Like, let's say we have a monarch butterfly image, and we want to make it blue. What we can actually do is just adjust our hue, and then we can change the orange of the butterfly to a blue. There's lots of different ways you could do that, or you could do selective color, which I'm going to go over in just a little bit. But what we have here is our master for colors. Then we can adjust each individual colors, the reds, the yellows, the greens, cyans, blues, and magentas, all within the hue and saturation. So we adjust our hue, and then our saturation is pretty much how much color is in the image. If I decrease it down all the way to -100, and we can see with -100 saturation that we have absolutely no color in the image at all. And then if we bring it up to +100, you can see that the colors are bleeding into each other, and there's an extremely large amount of that color in the image. And then we can, of course, adjust the hue. And then we have lightness on the bottom, which pretty much allows us to wash out the image more, or make it more of a dark. And that's more of a constant color. Lightness you might not use very much within your scene, or within your editing of an image. Because it's washing it out is not really that necessary. You always use other tools for that, brightness and contrast, levels, for that more of that correction. But it is there if you need to use it. We can also colorize our image within hue and saturation. So if we select colorize, what this allows us to do is set a overall color for the image. So I can go through here and select red, up the saturation, and now it's a very red image, and it's just running off one channel then. And you're just using one color for that image. Then we can adjust the lightness up and down if we need to. Go ahead and cancel that. Let's move on to the next. Desaturate is our next tool, which just removes all the color from the image, just like you were using the hue and saturation tool at -100 saturation. So that's pretty much the exact same thing. I'm going to go back, and now we have a match color tool. And match color tool, I'm not going to really go too far in depth with this, but what it allows us to do is have two open images within Photoshop. So what we can do is select our source, which will be another image, obviously not the same image, and we can adjust the luminance, the color intensity, and if we click OK, what will happen is it will match the color to another open image. So if we were matching up even blue screen effects, things like that. We want to match up the color to the actual image, or just any sort of compositing that we're doing, and we want to match up colors. That's a good way to do it for lighting, things like that. Or if we need to have just certain images the exact same color as another. So it's a neat way to sort of blend different images together and get the lighting and all that correct. So I'm going to go up here and go to our next one, which is replace color, which will allow us to replace one color with another, and we can go around using this eyedropper tool to select the color that we want and then what to replace it with. So we can replace this with more of a purple. So let's go in here and take a look at what this is actually doing. This is our before image. Now I hit preview so we can see after, and I'm selecting the color of our sky and then adjusting the hue for that. So this is a quick way I can adjust our sky to make it more like a sunrise or a sunset. And I can adjust the saturation on that, and then of course the lightness and all those good things. I can go down here and select the water, and I can adjust the color in that as well. And then the rocks, if need be. And we have kind of a neat little color change in there. So this is a very neat looking, or very good tool to have. We can adjust the fuzziness level, which is pretty much the bleeding of our color. We can make it very sharp, or we can make it an overall change of the color. And we can have it set as selection or as the actual image. So we can see the selection of what we're selected, or we can see the actual image and select from there. So this is a neat little tool as well to have. I'm going to hit cancel, adjustment, and our next one is selective color. Selective color allows us to individually edit specific colors within an image. On the top it says colors, and if we click on that, we have reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, magentas, whites, neutrals, and blacks. Well, since we mostly have blues and cyans in here, I'm going to select cyan, and let's start adjusting the color of all the cyan within this image. So I can increase the cyan, decrease it. I can increase the magenta, decrease yellow, or increase yellow, and then black will give us an overall contrast of that color. I'll go in there and change that to blues, and we can adjust that as well. And we can see that all these little changes are happening, and it's kind of subtle. We have relative and absolute, depending on how specific you want to be with these colors, and you get different effects with them. We can also adjust our blacks so that all of our blacks have a specific tint color to them. We can see we can add that, change that color as well, and same thing with our whites and our neutrals. So this is a very powerful tool when you want to just change one specific color to another, and it's isolated by a specific color. So it's a pretty neat little tool to have. Cancel, image, adjustment, and go to our next one from selective colors. So now we have our channel mixer. Channel mixer is pretty much the exact same thing we had before, except we are working with red, green, and blue, and then sort of varying each of these colors throughout, adjusting our contrast. Now we can adjust the green channel, and you can see that green is automatically set to 100 on each one of these, and then we can adjust our variations within each one of the colors. And it's best just pretty much play around with this and really see what it does. We can also set it to monochromatic, so that way we can have it pretty much black and white and adjust it that way. Click OK, and you'll see that it'll save that out. So it's pretty neat looking. So there's a lot we can do with that tool. And let's go to our next one, which is a gradient map. Now, gradient map is great for creating, for doing black and white photography. I can adjust the black and white, and now it immediately converts it to a black and white image. We still need to adjust, of course, maybe the levels or the brightness and contrast. We can also reverse this so it inverts our image and add a little bit of a dither to it, which will be blending between certain colors. But we can set any one of these preset gradients to map itself over the image from the lightest to the darkest, and we get some interesting looking colors in there. We could also create our own gradient if we wanted to. We can select new gradient, give it a name, and then of course adjust that. So we can double click on our gradient right here, and then go and adjust it like we did before when we were adjusting gradients. I'm going to cancel and cancel again, and we're going to move on to our next option, which is our photo filter. Photo filter allows us to change a mood of an image by adjusting its overall color. We have a warming filter and a cooling filter, and we can really change the mood of an image by using different colors. And this allows us to just overlay a color onto the image to inflict emotion, or just have maybe an eerie look to something. And we can just go ahead and use either of these presets, or we can select a color and really pick it out ourselves and increase the amount and decrease the amount, which is under density, and then of course preserve luminosity, which is either darkening, which will darken it if we do not have that on. But if we preserve luminosity, then we still have those same brightness and contrast, but we can change the overall color. So photo filter is really neat to use, and you can also use it down in the layers panel as well to apply to all different layers. We're going on to the next one, which is our shadow and highlight. And shadow and highlight is newer to the CS series. in Photoshop. And what it allows us to do is brighten up our shadows and our highlights of our image, which is good to give an overall effect. If you want to, it pretty much removes all depth from the image for the most part. And we have our basic shadows and then highlights, and then of course the more we adjust, the more it removes of one of those different options. But if we go click show more options, we obviously have a lot more here. We can adjust our color correction, our midtone contrast, tonal width for our shadows, and the radius, how much it affects, and we can see that going through the image and how much is really washing it out. Same thing with the highlights. We have that tonal width along with our radius that we can adjust, and then the overall amount. So the best way to really learn this tool is to kind of play around with it with darker images, lighter images, ones with shadows and not, and just sort of play around with it because it's going to be a very useful tool when you're editing certain types of images. And then our last one in this section is exposure. And now exposure is a great tool for HDRI images, in other words 32-bit images, but we can also use it within lower bit depth images, and it's pretty much just adjusting our exposure. So let's say we have this darker image that we have right here. We can just up our exposure, and now it looks like the camera is receiving more light, and we get a much brighter image. So that's another quick way to edit this sort of image. Like I said, there's a lot of different tools that do exactly the same thing, but they do it differently. So now we have even more options. We can adjust the offset, and then of course the gamma. And like I said, the best way is just really play around with it. But now you can see we have a very high contrast image by adjusting our exposure. And we also have a black point, midpoint, and white point on this tool as well. So it's another way to sort of adjust this image. And now we're going to take a little last couple of options here where we have invert, which will just invert our image, making the black white and the white black, and then everything in between the exact opposite of where it's at on the spectrum. And then we have equalize, which will overall equalize our image. The best way to really see that is with our histogram. So if we take a look at our histogram here, we can see it up on the top. And let's go back to those options and select equalize, and now you can see that instead of that big hump we had before, we have an overall equal balance between light and dark in our image. In this case, I think it's a little overexposed, but it is a quick way to get that sort of effect, depending, of course, on what you're working on. The next thing we have is threshold, which will allow us to really clip out one specific layer of our image. And we can use this. And this works great for blending modes and removing certain parts of objects. We can also make masks out of these. And I'm just going to move that into place. Click OK, and now you see it saves it like that, where we have a threshold where it's just pretty much black and white. Undo that and go back up. And our last one right here is Posterize. And this will allow us to use only a certain level of colors. We can, of course, change that. I could bring it up to 32. I could go down to 1 or 2, 3. And as we type in these numbers, they change the amount of posterization that we have within our photo. So it's kind of a neat little effect and sort of like a filter. Cancel, and now take a look at our last adjustment, which is variations. Variations is a neat little tool because it allows us to see the effect that we'll have if we add more colors. This is our original image right here, and then we have our current pick where we can add more green to that image if we want. Maybe it needs a little more red. We can make it a little lighter, make it a little bit darker, lighter again, more magenta, more blue, more cyan, more yellow, maybe a little bit lighter. And this is just the midtones. Then we can adjust the shadows, the highlights, the saturation, how fine or coarse the image is, and that blending, show clipping or not. And then we can even load and save these different presets that we do for these images. So it's a pretty neat little effect we have there for editing our images, and it gives us pretty much variations. Go ahead and cancel, and that's pretty much all of our image adjustments that we have under adjustments. We can also change and rotate our canvas if we want to within the image mode. We could change the pixel aspect ratio, which we don't really need to worry about unless you're working with television or film, mostly television. And we could rotate the canvas 90 degrees clockwise, counterclockwise, 180 degrees arbitrary. We can flip it horizontally, vertically. So I can flip that vertically right now. Could go back and go to adjustment, or sorry, rotate canvas 90 degrees clockwise. We could rotate the image that way. And there's lots of different adjustments you can do in there, and just play around with it and learn the best way to edit your images.